Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to our website irishhistoryshow.ie, or you can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/the Irish History Show. Now, it's been a very eventful couple of weeks that have gone by with regards to commemorations, and today we were going to discuss the controversy surrounding the recent attempt by the government to commemorate the RIC. So, John, first and foremost, what do you think of this whole idea of commemorations?
Well, that's a big question. So, we're partway through this decade of centenaries now, where we're supposed to almost relive what happened 100 years ago. It's been noticeable that, the Irish government hasn't wanted to say they're celebrating almost at any stage, the events that led to Irish independence. As a history person, I must say I'm very ambivalent about commemorations, because on the one hand, it is great for public interest in history and public engagement with history. You do get to reach a lot more people. It also does provoke people to do more research and more work. So, we have seen probably a lot more work into the Irish Revolution over the last 10 years as a result. But on the other hand, the bad thing about commemorations from a history point of view, I think, is a commemoration has to be about what does it all mean and what does it all mean for now. So an awful lot of the time with commemorations, what it really is about is packaging a version of the past that's palatable for the present, that's politically useful for the present. And what was kind of interesting was that the 1916 Rising, which is obviously such a symbolic event, was able to be packaged in 2016 in an almost non-political way. So there was talk about everyone, to paraphrase James Connolly, did their duty according to their lights kind of thing. And there was no right and there was no wrong. And there was, the workers' movement, and there was feminists. And funny enough, if you didn't know, you might not think that the insurgents were nationalists in 1916 and were out for an independent Ireland. And you had things like people talking about the Irish soldiers in the British Army at the same time, and the British soldiers who came to Dublin. And for some reason, it didn't seem to be that problematic, even though, it exposes, I think, the difference between our perception of political violence and its reality, because 1916 was a bit more like a conventional battle, and there were flags and uniforms and clearly defined kind of combatants. But it was a horrendously violent event by Irish standards, and nearly 300 civilians were killed and several thousand injured. There was incidents of the British Army breaking into houses in the North Inner City, in North King Street, and killing all the men and boys they found there. There was incidents of the volunteers shooting people who were looting or who were trying to break down their barricades or who otherwise objected to them. There was a lot of wanton killing, actually, of civilians in the Rising, but none of this seemed to matter greatly. And even the executions certainly caused bitterness at the time, but didn't cause any bitterness in 2016. Now, what you're seeing now, though, as we enter the War of Independence centenary period, which was a much different kind of conflict. It was a conflict of assassinations and ambushes, and people have a harder time with this idea of political violence, even though, it's actually much less concentrated violence than the Rising. But the idea of fair fight, people still seem to have this idea, which generally there wasn't in the War of Independence. You decided to kill someone and you went out and tracked them down and killed them. Was how the majority of people died. People also died in combat, but the majority were probably targeted killings. And also, I think the War of Independence is very stark in terms of its polarization. There's no way to say, Asquith, for example, the Prime Minister, said after the Rising that the rebels conducted themselves with great bravery or gallantry, and they were misled into this awful business. And nobody said this in 1920. It was quite clear this is a very politicized insurrection. It's throughout Ireland. First of all, they've seized political power through the ballot box, and then the local councils, they're replacing the court system, and they're trying to replace the police in a lot of areas, and then they're launching an armed insurgency. So it's quite clear they're not being misled. It's very stark. The Dáil has its claim. The first Dáil has its claim as the legitimate authority, and they say British authority, and anyone, it's illegitimate, and anyone cooperating with it is a traitor, a collaborator. So I think it's harder to commemorate through this lens of reconciliation that the Irish governments have wanted to use. you kind of had to pick a side. You have to say either the Dáil was legitimate or it wasn't. Either British authority was legitimate or it wasn't. And I think the RIC thing kind of really exposed this, because if you were to say, as Charlie Flanagan, the then Minister for Justice, said, the RIC men were just policemen and they were enforcing the law and protecting the community and they were murdered, and that's what he said. Yeah. You are saying that the Republican authority that they declared in 1919 was wrong, was illegitimate, and that the RIC were right, they were upholding the law. You have to make these choices when you're speaking about that conflict. It's not possible just to say, well, everybody had their own point.
Well, that's what seems to be the funny thing with a lot of the discussions that went on. In one sense, the government wants to depoliticise the commemorations, or almost not take a stand in any way. Like, we're not like another country who gained independence, who is celebrating the people, the activists, the revolutionaries who got us the independence, the public movement that got us the independence. It's like, we're just going to commemorate it all. Nobody was right, nobody was wrong, everyone's equally the same. Whereas at the same time, you have the Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan, making these value judgments, with using the word murder, that policemen were murdered. If you have a revolutionary movement that's going to come up against the state, that's hoping to overthrow the state, the first thing it's going to encounter is the police force.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think you've put your finger on why the RIC commemoration was so problematic. It wasn't only this depoliticised thing, which can be a problem, but like the state appeared to take sides on the other side, on the pro-British side, if you like. Minister Flanagan was, as we said the RIC were upholding the law and they were murdered. That's a very clear statement of who was right and who was wrong. And I think, obviously it was seen through the lens of more recent history. So, many members of Fine Gael at senior level, not so many now, but some would have served through the Troubles, and they would have seen the Gardaí as the legitimate authority and the Provisional IRA as criminals, and far, far, far fewer, but some Gardaí were shot by the Provisional IRA and more were intimidated, and they probably see it through that light. Now, I think, speaking kind of historically, there was a lot of kind of misconceptions, and I think government thinking would have done well from some good historical briefings. For instance, the law that the RIC was upholding in Ireland in 1919, 1920, going back to 1914 in some ways, was emergency law, right? So that means things like the right to trial by jury was in many cases suspended. Certainly after the summer of 1920 it was. And before that also in some cases, you had the right to be executed by a military court-martial. Or the right is the wrong word.
The privilege.
Yeah, exactly. But in other words, civilians could be tried by court-martial and executed and interned, and they were. There was official reprisals, so like the community in general was held responsible for the actions of the volunteers. Now this happened unofficially really in 1920, but it happened officially from December 1920 until July 1921, or June 1921. This is not normal upholding the law. This is something different. This is fighting a conflict. And just one more point on that, like, another thing which the government reacted kind of disparagingly to people who said this, but like they said, well, it's not commemorating the Black and Tans, and how dare you conflate the RIC with the Black and Tans? Well, the Black and Tans were the RIC. I mean, Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary, got up in Parliament and he said, this is in 1920, and said, just to clear up any confusion, the so-called Black and Tans are just ordinary constables of the RIC, and the Auxiliary Division are also members of the RIC, although they have a separate organisation. So, like, a couple of good history briefings would have been useful, I think, for the people involved.
Yeah, well, we did see that the historical committee that's supposed to advise the government, they said, don't blame this on us, we weren't asked our opinion. Now, I don't know how much that was arse covering from them, after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was because, the historical committee did apparently say, don't forget to commemorate the DMP and the RIC, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Now, afterwards, they said, well, we didn't mean a commemoration. We meant like some sort of a conference where their role could be explained or something like that. But it was interesting that whereas Dermot Ferreter hung the minister out to dry, I might say, by saying, well, we didn't intend this at all. The likes of Maurice Manning and Halpin said, well, we did say this actually. So there might have been wires crossed there.
Well, as you were saying there about the situation in Ireland regarding the type of law that was being enforced at the time, and it wasn't normal peacetime law. We should also say that the Royal Irish Constabulary weren't a normal police force in the British sense that you would get a police force in Manchester or London or Birmingham or somewhere. Like, how did the RIC differ as a police force in Ireland than, say, a local constabulary in England?
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to say though. I mean, we shouldn't be too kind of Anglocentric about this, because the RIC were not unlike, say, the Gendarmerie in France or the Guardia Civil in Spain or the Carabinieri in Italy, like, which are all parts of the army actually, and still are today. The RIC was not like the local police forces in Britain, because the model of British policing was unarmed police, which are responsible to the local elected government, and they were usually municipal forces. It's strange in a way, because Britain still doesn't have a nationwide police force, which is unusual. The Dublin Metropolitan Police conformed to this model, like they were unarmed for the most part, except for their detectives. But the RIC was a different thing. The RIC was modelled on the Rifle Brigades, actually, the light infantry of the British Army. It was armed with carbines and revolvers. And it was organised in a kind of a military style. I mean, their stations, although they didn't really resemble barracks, they were always called barracks. That they were a couple of times a year, the RIC was mustered for military drill and so on. Now, people will say that the RIC by, say, 1910-ish didn't really look like that anymore. Because yes, they were armed, and yes, the military drill was still practiced. Yes, most of their senior officers had actually come across from the British Army after they retired from the army. So in that sense, it was like a gendarmerie. It was an armed national police force. It was responsible to Dublin Castle. It wasn't responsible to elected government of anybody in Ireland. It was responsible to the British administration, which was in Dublin Castle. Like, just in a slight tangent, misconception people have had talking to people is that, well, Ireland was just part of the UK. Well, it wasn't really. I mean, Ireland was semi-detached from the UK. There was an Irish government based in Dublin Castle, but it was appointed from Britain. The RIC's supporters, I would say, or the people who would sympathise with the RIC would make the point, well, they generally didn't carry arms by 1910. Their stations were called barracks, but they were just converted houses. They lived in very small groups throughout the countryside, and as well as enforcing the law, they were also involved in things like taking the census and so on like that. Like many things, there's two sides to it, but certainly no, I mean, the RIC was not a civil municipal force. It was a semi-military force, and it was designed that way. And what's interesting as well is, I would counter the argument that said the RIC had changed into something different, which is, in 1916, for example, outside of Dublin, when, for example, the volunteers took over the town of Ashburn, or the police station at Ashburn, County Meath, immediately a large, well-armed force of RIC appeared on the scene. And there was quite a significant battle up in Ashburn, which shows that the RIC was capable of very short notice of armed action, as that was one of its functions. And of course, originally it was the Irish Constabulary, founded in the 1830s. It got the Royal for helping to put down the Fenian insurrection of 1867. You can't overlook either of those things. I mean, the RIC's function was to help enforce British rule in Ireland. At the same time, the RIC, as it existed, was quite poorly prepared for guerrilla warfare. Because a lot of its members, a lot of its constables would have seen themselves as ordinary police. It's a multi-sided question, but the bottom line is the RIC's role was to protect and enforce British rule in Ireland.
Yeah, there's no getting around that.
No getting around it. That's the simple fact.
And also another thing, the RIC would have had a huge intelligence role in Ireland. Like, I think with the when the threat of conscription came up, one of the roles that they have was basically house by house, sending reports about people's political views, what would happen, what to expect from them if there was an outbreak of violence based on enforcing conscription in Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's ever read the RIC's county reports from this time will see that one of their functions was to talk about what is the political opinions in the locality. And if there are separatist, or as they were referred to, I think, seditious organisations, that was their job. They had to report on what they were doing and who they were and what they were saying and how many people sympathised with them. That was part of the RIC's role, yeah, absolutely. I mean, as regards intelligence, the only thing I'd say is the RIC wasn't particularly good at that. I mean, they didn't have really a detective division. That was mostly farmed out to the G division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So the RIC had very kind of on-the-ground intelligence. They didn't have a detective division really, or a special branch on the model of Scotland Yard, or even of the Guards would have today.
I think one of the things when we're looking at this period, the first thing really that comes to mind is Solohead Beg, although it's not the first time when there's violence between police and Republicans. But a lot is made of the fact that the constables who were shot, they were Irish speakers, they had large families, they were very ordinary Irish men, And I think the commemorations to do with Solihull Beg, they included families of both the Republicans and the surviving family members of the RSC men who'd been killed, and most people seemed happy with the way that those commemorations had passed off without any of the controversy that has surrounded these proposed commemorations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on it earlier when you said that there wasn't this level of judgment in that particular commemoration. I mean, even though Mr. Flanagan did say some of those things at that, but I mean, there was a service held, and people, representatives from both sides of that ambush were there, and there wasn't this thing of, well, these people were right and these people were wrong, you know, which I think people would be much more comfortable with. What people were really uncomfortable with was this idea of the RSC were right in 1920. And I think people were right to be angry at that, or right to disagree with that, especially when we talk about what the RSC became in 1920-21.
Well, that's the thing. When we get into 1920 and 21, there was a lot of serving members of the RSC that had either decided to surreptitiously support the Republican movement or resign altogether from the force. So to remain within the force was taking a very definite view of where you stood in regards to the conflict and who was right and who was wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, this goes back to the point I was trying to make a few minutes ago, which is it's not the kind of conflict where you can say, well, everyone is right a little bit. Unfortunately, if you're in the police or if you were serving the government in any way, really, you had to make a choice. Now, yes, a lot of RIC men resigned, not only because they agreed with the first Dáil, but also there was a lot of intimidation. There was a boycott of the RIC. But there was also many RIC members who did help the Republicans. You see this all the time. I myself, for example, looked into the policeman who claimed to have saved Michael Collins' life in County Roscommon. I'm a little sceptical about that, but certainly he was helping the local IRA, and that wasn't that uncommon. Those who stuck around, you know, I can understand their decision because probably they were thinking more about their pension than the Crown. But the fact is that they were taking sides in what was becoming a war. You know, and that's the stark reality of the time. People had to make very difficult choices, but they made them.
Well, I think another myth that needs to be exploded as well is that the atrocities were carried out by, and intimidation were carried out by the new imported members of the RIC, that this was all the work of black and tans and auxiliaries. Yeah,
it's a convenient myth, that one. You know, like, there's a couple of things to say. I mean, just kind of backtracking a little bit on the actual history. So, the second last commissioner of the RSC was Joseph Byrne, who was an Irishman, a Catholic, if you want to attribute tribal loyalties to him. What he recommended as the crisis was brewing in Ireland was that the RSC actually be disarmed and they be transferred more into a civil police. And he was effectively fired by Sir John French, the Lord Lieutenant, and Walter Long. And there they made the conscious decision to go for a militarised police force. And so they started recruiting people who we refer to as black and tans. Now, just a point on that there was no such thing as the black and tans. The black and tans were members of the RIC, recruited mostly from Britain. Mostly they were veterans of the First World War or other ex-servicemen. The force was also rearmed. For example, they were given the service rifle of the British Army, and they were given machine guns and grenades and so on like this, armoured vehicles too. But right until the end of the War of Independence, if you look at any particular ambush and the police casualties, they're likely to be at least 50% so-called old RIC, and there might be 50%, you know, relatively recent British recruits. And in terms of reprisals, this is the point you were making, I think, Carl, there's no shortage of RIC, Irish, old so-called RIC, who did reprisals. Famously, you know, Tomás McCurtain, the mayor of Cork, was shot dead by a squad of RIC men who were regular Irish RIC men. There was a death squad, so-called, or the murder gang was the term at the time, up in Roscommon, for example, which was exclusively Irish. Even in places like Galway, which were kind of terrorised by black and tans and auxiliaries. I recently was reading John Cunningham's book about this, and it's amazing because Galway wasn't that violent a county, but the Crown forces were extremely harsh there. But it was the Irish RIC who would point out targets to the auxiliaries, for example, and some really horrendous murders like the Loughnane murders, the murder of Father Michael Griffin, you know, stuff like this. If you stuck around in the RIC, and unless there was some people who kind of, you know, stayed in the station, didn't do anything, there was some who helped the IRA, quite a few, But if you didn't do any of those things and you were involved in the war, most of them were involved all the way. They did killings, they did reprisals, killings, they did burnings, they participated in, for example, the reprisals after the Renine ambush in September 1920, where Ennistimon and Milltown Malbay and Renine itself were largely burnt down, and there was a number of people killed. That was a mixed force, including old RIC, who had presumably been stationed there for a long time. The old RIC's hands were not clean. Let's not be under any illusions.
And we have a tendency to look at history backwards and assume there was always going to lead to independence or a free state. In that period, during the War of Independence, and it's even funny, there were people, very diehard Southern Unionists, who believed that the whole concept of Home Rule would have been gone altogether, that they just would have stayed at the UK. This all could have been defeated, the separatist idea. So that us thinking back, or us looking at it now, assuming that independence was coming and all these men in the RIC, what were they hanging on for? Must have been a certain amount of RIC members who would have assumed that, the IRA and the Republican movement could have been defeated completely.
Oh, yeah.
And the RIC would have continued on indefinitely as the police force in Ireland.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, certainly in 1919 and for a good chunk of 1920, that might have looked a lot less likely in late 1920, 1921. But, oh yeah, I mean, I would assume most RIC constables and officers thought that they were going to be the police force of whatever settlement emerged in Ireland. And the RIC would have been the police in Home Rule Ireland. Like, I think we've made the point on this podcast before that Home Rule was actually a very limited amount of self-government, and that the police wouldn't have been under the control of the Irish Parliament. That would have remained the same under the Home Rule Act of 1914 and 1920. It was a whole other discussion, but like British policy after the First World War was kind of very equivocal about this. So like Home Rule had been enacted. On the other hand, you had very high-ranking people like Sir John French who thought that Home Rule should just be quietly scrapped and they could have something they called federalism. So like Ireland could have some sort of government but with very little power. There was division of opinion, but British policy was in flux about this. And what they did in the end prior to the treaty was, of course, they had two Home Rule parliaments, the Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. But yeah, like it's certainly not the case Irish independence was inevitable. Absolutely not. I mean, some form of self-government, yeah, but how much that was going to be, what it would have looked like as I said again, I mean, Home Rule would have left the police under the control of Dublin Castle. The British Army would have been the army of Ireland. In any foreign policy thing, Ireland would have been part of the UK. So yeah, I mean, I take your point.
Well, another thing we have to look at as well, if we're looking back through history, we forget that this was an all Ireland. We always look at things through the prism of partition and assume that, like, the 26 county Ireland was Ireland. The RIC was a 31 county body. So obviously Dublin having its own police force.
Well, Dublin County was also policed by the RIC. Dublin City only was policed by the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So it was 32 county. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we look at the RIC and we talk about things like the McCurtain murder and various different reprisals, we also have to look into the role of the RIC in the north in what would become the 6 counties. And there's a lot of blood on their hands in that area.
There was. I mean, one of the funny things, though, about the RIC in the north was that the RIC's rank and file was majority Catholic. So the Ulster Unionists really were rather suspicious of the RIC. And if you go back to, for example, 1886 and the anti-Home Rule riots in Belfast at that time, which were extremely bloody, I think there was 25 people killed, many of whom were actually Unionist rioters who were shot by the RIC. So you have a different dynamic in the north, and that's one of the reasons why the Unionists proto-government, or the Unionists anyway, raised the Ulster Special Constabulary in 1920, starting in 1920, which was their own armed police force. Having said that, I mean, some officers of the RIC in the north, notably John Nixon up in Belfast, was behind many of the most gruesome atrocities carried out on that side. For example, the McMahon murders, where a family who were actually loyal to Joe Devlin and the Irish Parliamentary Party were basically wiped out. All the male members of the family were shot by police who broke into their house and shot them in bed. The Ireland Street murders, where they broke down houses and killed people with random civilians, I should add, in West Belfast with guns and with sledgehammers, was carried out again probably by John Nixon. May have been a mixed RIC special force. But yeah, I mean, people have made this point as well that in the north of Ireland, the RIC's hands weren't clean either. Now there is, and another thing to mention actually is that quite a few RIC men who were disbanded in 1922 were sent north and joined the RUC originally. But having said that, there is a certain amount of truth in the statement that the RIC was perceived by Northern Catholics as a much more neutral force than either the Special Constabulary or the RUC that followed them. So there's a little bit both ways there.
If we're looking at the problematic actions of the RIC, we have to include the whole of the country, yeah.
Completely.
So this is the thing that the government didn't seem willing to acknowledge, that the RIC had a problematic history, and sometimes a lot more than problematic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was irritating kind of about the controversy, I thought in some ways the controversy showed a great public engagement with history. I thought that was a good thing. I mean, I didn't enjoy some of the bias about it by people who were against the commemorations either, like people saying that the RIC were like the SS and stuff, which is way too far to go. But there was, on the other side, there was a certain amount of kind of condescension and disparaging from the government point of view. Like Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, said, well, people don't mind commemorating the Irish soldiers in the First World War now, so in time people will commemorate the RIC in the same way, not appearing to realise that these were two very different propositions. So the men who went to fight in the First World War in the various battlefields in the British Army didn't fight against Irish independence. They weren't charged with putting down Irish independence, and that was the role of the RIC. That was the RIC's job. And it does go back to the point that we're making. This was a time of stark choices and stark divisions, and it can't be wished away by commemoration.
Well, the government response, because there was genuine anger, I think, from an awful lot of people about this, but the government's response didn't seem to acknowledge any of this from the public. It seemed to be a very petulant, dismissive response to the feeling among the general population that this was a bad idea.
It did, and I mean, one of the things that struck me as odd about this was it actually annoyed a lot of Fine Gael supporters as well, because Fine Gael's heritage is kind of convoluted in some ways, but there is a very strong nationalist wing of Fine Gael and Fine Gael support that traces it all the way back to Michael Collins and the old IRA. It was not only among Sinn Féin supporters or Fianna Fáil supporters or anybody else. The Fine Gael supporters also disapproved, polls show this, of the RIC commemoration. So I think it was very misconceived.
Yeah, there seems to be an opinion coming from the government that this was backwoodsmen who are complaining about the RIC, and if we were to be mature and responsible, we should be willing to commemorate the RIC.
Without appearing to acknowledge that this does have a political meaning, commemorating the RIC, that it is saying something about the validity of Irish independence and stuff. They didn't seem, for some reason, this didn't seem to have occurred to them.
No, and also some people were saying that Fine Gael, as like a very conservative party, the idea of law and order and maintaining the status quo and supporting those who are in uniform, maintaining the status quo, was very important, and reconciling the memory of the RIC. But, as you say, that's taking a stand one way or the other. That's coming down on the side of those who were tasked with preventing Irish independence.
Yeah, and it does actually, as I said, imply commemorating the Black and Tans and auxiliaries as well, because they were part of the RIC. Just one more point on that, which is the polls show that, 70% of Fine Gael supporters were also against it. So, I really think they got this one wrong, even from their own point of view.
Well, it really hung around their necks like an albatross within a couple of weeks of going into a general election. And we even saw Fine Gael posters defaced with RIC,
Black and Tans
written on.
Yeah. And I mean, some people whose ancestors were in the RIC got in touch with me via my website, because obviously I was speaking about this. And I mean, I do understand their point that, their relatives thought they had a job and that they were doing a job and they were killed. I understand that, but the real problem with the commemoration was this judgmental thing. Had they had some sort of service saying, well, we're sorry anyone died and let's commemorate them all, that would have been okay. But there's this judgmental thing of the RIC were right. I think that was the problem.
What do you think about the idea that there is a difference between commemorating your great-grandfather who was a sergeant in the RIC and commemorating the RIC itself as a body.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is kind of repeating the point that we're making, but the RIC was a body whose rule it was to enforce British rule or to maintain British rule in Ireland. It was armed. It was not under the control of Irish government, local government, or any other kind of government. And that's, that, and a full stop. You can't get away from that fact. If people want to celebrate, the Union or so on, maybe, they might want to celebrate the RIC, but it is a political choice, I mean, but what's interesting as well is that there was another misconception, I think, exposed. For example, Newton Emerson, the Irish Times columnist, who was obviously from a Northern Unionist background, and wrote, well, this shows what, disrespect to my tradition. It doesn't actually, because the RIC was quite disliked and distrusted by most Ulster Unionists, which is why they raised their own armed police.
Well, I've seen a good response to that where somebody said, I'm an Irish Protestant and state-sanctioned murder and reprisals are not part of my background.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, this was just real bad history, I thought, because the RIC did not represent Irish Protestants. It was a majority Catholic organisation, but it did represent British rule in Ireland. Projecting the RIC onto the Irish Protestant community is a fallacy,
Yeah.
And I mean, what's very interesting as well is looking back to the actual time and the history is a lot of Protestants, Irish Protestants at the time, were really appalled by what the RIC became in terms of reprisals and Black and Tan period. The likes of W.B. Yeats, for example, this is what turned them into separatists, people who had been kind of moderate nationalists of some sort. As I said, projecting the RIC onto Protestant identities is really wrong. That's just not the way it was. I mean, many Southern Protestants were Unionists at the time. That doesn't necessarily mean they saw the RIC as representing them in any particular way.
And we can't stress it enough that the Black and Tans were permanent pensionable members of the RIC.
Yeah, and I mean, even a lot of people who would be closer to my own views on this, they got this wrong, when they were talking about it. There was a lot of talk that the Black and Tans were the special reserve of the RIC, which is quite wrong. There was no such thing. There was a reserve force which was in the Phoenix Park. New recruits were certainly sent to the depot and they were given some training. Not enough training in policing, but they were given training. And maybe that's where the confusion comes from. But the Black and Tans were not a special reserve. They weren't a special corps within the RIC. They were the RIC. The name comes from, there wasn't enough police uniforms. The police uniform was dark green, but looked black. They were given whatever police uniform was available and then surplus military uniform. So khaki and black and tan. By the end of 1920, that was actually rectified. So they were all wearing, by 1921, they were all wearing police uniform. There's no two ways about it. The Black and Tans were RIC constables. And as I said before, I think the Chief Secretary clarified this helpfully in Parliament, so we have a nice quote. The auxiliaries, slightly different thing. And one of the things to say, to be fair, is I get the impression an awful lot of Black and Tans were ill-disciplined and drunken and so on and beat people up. But the really bad things generally were done by the auxiliaries, which was a special corps of ex-officers. They had their own uniform. They had special weapons and so on like that. And everywhere where you look at the auxiliary companies, they generally were pretty feared and loathed. I read a few years ago a collection of Dublin tenement lore. The name of the author escapes me, but and very interesting what they say. They say the average British soldier, the Tommy, was a gentleman, and the DNP, the peeler, they would have been used to that. But the Black and Tans, and this really meant the auxiliaries because they talked about guys with berets and so on like that. They said that they were criminals, that they were, they would break into your house looking for suspects or whatever, but they would break anything they found. They would steal things. And you see this a lot, the behaviour really was very bad. But again, the auxiliaries, even though they had a separate command, they weren't really under RIC control. They were the RIC Auxiliary Division. So they were part of the RIC as well.
They were on temporary contracts. They
Correct.
weren't permanent members of the RIC. Correct.
But the so-called Black and Tans were permanent pensionable constables. That's the reality.
And we've mentioned it before, but the Special Constabulary, in their relationship to the RIC, and I suppose you've covered this in the Irish Story website with some of the guest contributors you've had there recently. The Ulster Special Constabulary, it wasn't supposed to be exclusively an Ulster Special Constabulary. These were special constables that could have been rolled out throughout the whole country. Yeah,
and John O'Neill cleared this up for me. I didn't actually realise this beforehand, but there was a provision in British law for the recruitment of special constables in time of emergency, and they were recruited in times of strikes or, other emergencies. There were special constables, I think, during the Second World War as well, if I'm not mistaken. But the special constables, there was some of them recruited throughout the rest of Ireland as well. But really, the ones we talk about, the specials, were in the 6 counties that would become Northern Ireland. In theory, they were recruited as special constables to the RIC, but they were under RIC command. The commander of the force was an RIC colonel. It's a little bit more problematic to say that the specials were RIC, I think, because they outlived the RIC, and they became a permanent thing in Northern Ireland in the form of the B specials, which was one branch. Certainly in 1920-21, they were part of the RIC. They were special constables of the RIC under their command.
Something to think about, and it hasn't really been touched on that much. I think probably it made more of an impression than people think, is the effect that it had on the recent general election, and the effect that it had, maybe not solely as an issue in itself, but it did feed into a perception that Fine Gael and Leo Varadkar and the government were very out of touch, very high-handed. The response that they gave to the criticism over the RIC commemoration, they seemed to be a government that weren't willing to countenance anyone contradicting their opinion on things, and certainly didn't help them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important issues in the election were housing and healthcare and general kind of inequality, I would say, in our society. Having said that, I think you're 100% right. I mean, I think that people's perception of the cabinet, let's say, in the Taoiseach, was of kind of being out of touch or out of sympathy with the problems faced by most people, which explains, I think, the large vote for Sinn Féin in the general election more than kind of, 32 county republicanism. But national identity is very important for Irish people. And I think the understanding of history is unusually important for Irish people, possibly because of the weakness of other forms of identity like the Irish language and so on. But Irish history is extremely important for the identity of most Irish people. The fact that the government seemed to be kind of disrespecting disrespecting the central kind of modern narrative of the Irish state and how it came to be, I think it was a problem for them. Sinn Féin may have got the votes mostly in housing and stuff, and I think they did, but it certainly, it's not inconsistent with Sinn Féin's message, let's say, to say that the people who run what some of them still call the Free State are, a gang of traitors. I certainly wouldn't say that, but certain Sinn Féin supporters would say that.
Well, I can't remember where I seen it, but I thought it was a very interesting take on the whole thing. It was somebody from Britain was saying that British political memory or discussion tends to not to go back further than Thatcher in the 80s.
Yeah, Tim Ellis, I think, said this. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
and that must be where I'd seen it. But somebody looking at all these discussions regarding the RIC commemoration would assume that this is something that happened in the last 10 years and we're discussing it now, because it's so animated people and so many people across the political spectrum across the country. Yeah,
I mean, I've long thought this though, that Irish identity is very much bound up with our idea of history. It's in a way that's quite unusual, I think. And like I said, I do think it's very strongly to do with this idea of what makes us Irish. So, well, we don't speak the Irish language. People of our generation are not terribly tied into the old traditions of Irish life, let's say. But we do have this very strong idea of the narrative of where we come from and so on. So, I think it's disrespected at your peril if you're a politician.
Yeah, so in previous years, an Irish government or an Irish government minister would have got ready applause and popularity by bringing up the memory of the revolutionary period or certain things that happened in the past and wanting to be associated with it. Whereas this current government seems to go the complete opposite direction. The perception being that they were castigating those who had fought for Irish independence while commemorating those who had put a barrier to it.
Fought against Irish independence. Let's call a spade a spade. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, the narrative of kind of the big parties here in the south of Ireland used to be, well, there was an old IRA and they were good and noble in everything that they did. And then there was the modern IRA, which was the bad IRA, who were just criminals and terrorists. And it's interesting that wasn't used at all in the recent thing. I mean, it seemed to be very strongly that, the institutions of the state, whichever state it was almost, were correct, and that, people who attacked it were illegitimate, which is new, or relatively new, which you didn't really see in 2016, although it was very much mentioned at the start. It was very much self-focus and reconciliation non-judgmental, but you didn't see this thing of, well, the rebels were wrong. Not from the state, you didn't. Certainly some people say that, but it was odd in one way, but not all that surprising. If you look at the perspective of those people, you might call them statists in a way, not in an economic sense, but for example, they would generally talk about the Irish state. They wouldn't talk about a thing like the Irish nation, which is a much more emotional concept.
Yeah.
And they would talk about the rules of the state and the constitution, but they would talk about it in very formalistic legal terms. Leo Varadkar is smart enough to have rolled back a little bit on this, and he said since Fine Gael is the party that founded the state, although he does again say the state, and founded the republic, he said. So it's trying to reappropriate some of these things, but yeah, like their conception of nationality and loyalty is very bound up with this idea of the state, which is not completely inconsistent, but they have ditched some of the rhetoric previous generations, including of Fine Gael, would have used.
Yeah, and even taking that into account, we're talking about a different state.
That's right, but that's again that was the bad history.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the idea of taking up arms against legitimate state forces. As you mentioned earlier, the tradition that Fine Gael comes from, well, one of the traditions.
Correct.
One of the traditions.
Correct.
The pro-treaty Sinn Féin tradition was that this wasn't a legitimate state, and that taking on that power, that state power through its police and attacking them was legitimate.
And I mean, here's the thing, I would say that the majority of Fine Gael supporters feel that way, actually. Whatever about the high echelons of the party. But we might kind of conclude by talking about how the commemorations are going to go on, because if they thought this was bad, there's plenty more to come.
Yeah, well, we should also say as well that, it's with all the anger and heat that this has generated, the RIC had been commemorated in Dublin Castle at a ceremony a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and the DMP.
Yeah.
As well. Now, just before we move on, I mean, a word on the DMP, because the DMP and the RIC are not the same beast.
Yeah.
And the DMP was unarmed, and while it wasn't accountable to the Dublin Corporation, as its equivalent in Britain would have been, it was retained after the Free State and was founded until 1925, when it was just merged with the Gardaí. It's a different beast in that way, even though, the detective division, the G division, had been involved in, let's say, political activities. And 11 of their detectives were killed mostly by Michael Collins' squad. But yeah, I mean, the RIC was certainly privately commemorated. There's been no ban on relatives doing that. And the joint service, as we mentioned, at Solihull Beg, where both sides kind of were acknowledged, was, I think, the furthest the general public is willing to go in that sense.
But like all things, does it seem that when local groups and non-state groups are involved in commemorations and organising things, they seem to pass off with very little difficulty. When the state gets involved, there seems to be this huge muddle every time.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, I mean, it's the state saying something is of a different order to me or you saying it. The state is supposed to speak for all of us.
Yeah.
That's the idea anyway of a modern state. So, if the state says, well, we're commemorating the brave policemen who were murdered upholding the law, that's why it's so unpalatable. People can't just say, oh, well, that's your opinion and you're wrong, because your opinion is supposed to be my opinion, in a sense. So, I think they might have grasped this better. I'm sure they had other things to think about, to be fair, Brexit and various other things. Just one more point on Brexit is and how it ties into this stuff is I can't believe how reticent Fine Gael were to use their stance during Brexit in a nationalist way in the election. They could have said, we are the United Ireland Party, we kept the border open, which is part of Fine Gael's name, going back to 1932. And they don't seem to have done it at all.
I thought that was hilarious with the coverage of the election results in Britain. They so many commentators were portraying Fine Gael's seat loss as down to the anti-British policies of Leo Varadkar, and this was the Irish people punishing Fine Gael for being too nationalist. And I believe people would make that argument with a straight face. But you're absolutely right that Brexit was a very small issue after the fact, where people were asked about the reasons why they did vote. I say it's homelessness, it was health service, it was the cost of housing. Very few people were worried about Brexit. Right,
but I mean, Brexit is out of sight, out of mind, and it's going to reappear at the end of the year, and possibly in much more malign ways than people currently realise. But just from the point of view of kind of, public discourse, I was amazed at how little Fine Gael nationalist use, I'm trying to say, Fine Gael made it of their stance. Because the government did stand up to, if you like, the British government. They did insist on the border being open. And they seem to have been very, actually, totally in contrary to this kind of tabloid thing in Britain. They seem to be very reluctant to actually use this as an election tool. And it couldn't have hurt. Most people said Brexit wasn't a pressing issue at the moment. But Fine Gael didn't really try to use it either, I don't think. Or not that I could see. I mean, most of what they said seemed to be like, well, keep Sinn Féin out because they're a bunch of criminals. But let's move on. Let's talk about commemorations.
Well, we have quite a few coming up, and we are in the contentious period now.
Yeah.
We're going to start commemorating events from 1920 going into 1921. It's February 2020 now, and there are just so many contentious events, so many really horrible events involving civilians, involving atrocities, involving questionable actions by the IRA as well, with targeting civilians.
Absolutely.
Sectarian strife and sectarian conflict.
Yeah.
It's going to be a tall order commemorating these without controversy.
Absolutely. I mean, I have kind of mixed feelings about some of these things. Like, for example, Bloody Sunday is going to have its centenary. Bloody Sunday in Dublin in 1920 is going to have its centenary later this year. And I remember years ago leading a group of foreign students to Croke Park on a tour. And the guide, I'm not slagging him off, but I mean, what he told, you have to simplify for, especially in a foreign language. But he said, well, there was a bunch of spies and they were eliminated in the morning. And then the British came to Croke Park and they shot the people there. And I suppose that is essentially what happened. But this very judgmental word spies, that they had it coming, I mean, Bloody Sunday was a ruthless action by IRA intelligence, GHQ intelligence. They had a list of 35 men, and they were mostly killed in their beds, often in front of their wives. It's nothing to be proud of. You can argue maybe it was necessary and so on. Likewise, the Cork County Board in the GA has released a jersey for this year, a commemorative jersey, and so the Mayor Thomas McCurtain, the murdered Mayor of Cork, is going to be on one side. The memorial to the Kilmichael ambush is going to be on the reverse side. And, Kilmichael is a story for another day, but whatever you think about whether there was a false surrender and so on, what happened in the end was Tom Barry killed all the auxiliaries of that patrol. So 17 of them out of 18, one got away. He did kill them after they surrendered, according to his own account. Whether you think they had it coming because of false surrender, so on. But certainly all the accounts talk about, well, we finished off the ones who were wounded and we killed the ones who tried to surrender at the end. It's fairly vicious stuff. I'm not in favour of commemorating violence as a good thing, personally. I think, yes, commemorate the first Dáil and Irish independence very strongly. Celebrating violence, I'm not in favour of personally, in terms of commemoration. I don't know what you think about that, Cathal.
Well, I think these aren't the only two options. And I don't think that's what you're saying, is commemorate and celebrate on the one hand, or ignore on the other. There are so many other things that we could do. And for the stuff like Kilmichael, or instances where a lot of people have been killed, the last thing we should be doing is ignoring it. We could find a way to involve the public in finding out what happened, in discussing it and having events and publications and talks. You don't necessarily have to have the army band and a march and a parade for every single event. I
mean, people, my point or my opinion would be, if people want to do that, that's fine. As we said, local commemorations are good in that way because people can just talk to each other and say what they think. Yeah. I would be very uncomfortable with the idea of, state commemorations of individual acts of violence, On the other hand, I would be totally against also something along the lines of the RSC, where it was where the volunteers in the IRA of that era were painted as the bad guys, which again would be historical, but also, what message are you trying to send by that? That Irish independence was wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not up for that message personally.
Well, that's saying these are the conclusions you have to draw if you just follow through the logical argument of what you're making.
Exactly. Again, from my point of view, I would be strongly in favour, as I said, of commemorating the first and the second Dáil even, May 1921. And let's, the principle of Irish self-determination, acknowledging, remembering the armed campaign and so on that was parallel with it. Because people think also that we call it the War of Independence. I mean, that's not everything that was going on. For example, I mean, the political, the civilian stuff was in a way more important. And people like PSO Hegarty, for example, made this point that, you know, it wasn't all about it wasn't about the gunmen and so on. That was supposed to be ancillary to the main effort. And even Frank Gallagher, who's on the other side of the treaty divide, made this point as well. I mean, 4 glorious years refers not to the military struggle, but to the political struggle. I think in terms of the message that you're sending, that's the correct message. Would be my advice if anybody is listening.
Yeah, that makes me think as well, like, you know, what role should the state have in commemoration? The big events you're talking there with, that do lead to the establishment of the Free State, things like the first Dáil, things like second Dáil even, and so on. But other than providing funding and providing, like, you know, an umbrella for having these discussions and maybe coordinating some of the other stuff, what role should the state, if any, have in so many things? So you could go week by week through 2020 and 2021 and nearly have a different event every week of something significant that happened. Yeah,
and I mean, just when you raise that point, I mean, what it brings to my mind is the ambivalence of the actual Irish Revolutionary period, right? So apart from the declaration of the first Dáil in 1919, there isn't an unambiguous date where the Irish state can be, let's say, neutrally commemorated. You know, was it the passing of the treaty? Like, obviously that's very divisive. Was it the Government of Ireland Act? Certainly not. You know, was it the truce of July 11th, 1921? No, I believe the government's going to go for that. And I think that's reasonable enough, because in that way you can say, well, you know, armed struggle got to the negotiating table and that was good enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay, an okay message. And you can commemorate all the people who died up until the truce. Now, actually, lots of people died after the truce as well, especially in the north.
Absolutely.
But it is tricky. But I mean, the Irish Revolutionary period is actually very ambivalent. That's why there was a civil war at the end of it. But one thing as well to consider is that, again, this is a 32 county island. And the other big centenary is Northern Ireland was created in 1920. And how to mark that. And I mean, Unionists, I assume, would unambiguously want to mark it as a good thing. They have a number of dates. The Government of Ireland Act being passed in December 1920. They have the opening of the Northern Parliament in June 21. Or if they want to be really technical, the passing of executive powers in November 1921. Whichever date. But I mean, Unionists, I assume, would want to think of it as an birth of a nation. Northern nationalists, who are about 50% now of the population, they ain't going to go for that. I mean, how will it be handled in the north?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing as well with the creation of the Northern Statelet, with the creation of Northern Ireland. Across the board, Unionists were pretty happy with the 6-county territory. With the creation of the Free State in the 26 counties, that's not the case among nationalists, among Southern nationalists.
At the time, no, for sure.
Yeah, about half of them were very unhappy. And
certainly a third were very unhappy.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
And even among the ones that did support it, it was support with reservations.
Oh yeah, I mean, even Arthur Griffiths said that, yeah. But in Northern Ireland, though, I mean, it's possibly an even more difficult problem, no?
And like thinking back to how a 20th anniversary of the founding of Northern Ireland would have been celebrated, compared to how triumphalist it would have been the role of the Stormont government as it was then, how they would have been involved in commemorations, whereas Northern Ireland viewed, you know, we the people meant X amount of people who were unionists. How do you do it now?
And I mean, if there is to be commemorations of the birth of Northern Ireland, will the Sinn Féin members of the Northern Assembly attend?
Yeah.
Will the Irish government attend?
Yeah, see, that's the thing.
Tricky.
Like, you know, can you commemorate the birth of Northern Ireland? Yes. Can everyone commemorate the birth of Northern Ireland? Yes. Does everyone think that the birth of Northern Ireland was a good thing? No, not at all.
Yeah.
So can we have a commemoration where people with very, very striking different views can come together, discuss things? Certainly not in terms of a parade or a celebration, no. But conferences, articles, books, yes.
Conferences, articles, books, yes. Commemorations, as I understand the term, I don't think so. No, the Unionists will have a commemoration and no one else will attend, I would say.
Yeah, but you're not going to like shut down Belfast and everyone's going to join into one parade and march around City Hall.
Well, of course they could do that. And
that
kind of thing has been done in the past, but in the new climate, it probably wouldn't fit as well, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, John, well, I think we've covered that. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the audience for listening. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to irishhistoryshow.ie or follow us on Facebook / The Irish History Show, or on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod. And if you could rate or review the show on iTunes, we would really appreciate that. That would be really helpful to us. Thank you.